Hello and welcome once again to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and my guest today is Tom Condon. Hi Tom.
Hi.
And Tom's written a book which came into Conscious TV and we found interesting, and we thought we'd get him along when he was in the UK for an interview. And the book, the full title is The Dynamic Enneagram, How to Work with Your Personality Style to Truly Grow and Change. At the moment it's an e-book, but will be coming out shortly as well as a real book, as a paper book. So the Enneagram is something that I heard about many years ago, 20 years ago, and I found extraordinarily helpful in my life, not only in understanding myself better, but understanding and relating to other people better. And there's many different ways to look at the Enneagram, and Tom's going to we're going to cover his book and focus very much on the personality style to truly grow and change. So Tom, why don't you just, for people that haven't heard of the Enneagram, why don't you just give a brief 3-minute summary of what the Enneagram actually is?
It's a system of 9 personality styles on one level. There's also another way of conceiving of the Enneagram that is different from strictly talking about personality. The one that I deal with, though, and the one that is best known and that people respond to a lot, is a kind of compact system that describes 9 different personality styles and their sort of connections and interactions. And in that description, what you recognize are kind of 9 ways of perceiving reality, 9 ways of apprehending the world, and kind of specializing in a certain style of perception and a certain skew towards how you perceive and interact with the world around you. And I would say, in one sense, what the Enneagram is describing when it describes someone's personality style is a kind of reality strategy, a kind of strategy for making your way through the world, and a picture of the world, a map of the world that you have internally, a kind of internal representation that allows you to predict events and know where you are and know who you are in a world where other people seem to know where they are or who they are. But it's got to do with worldviews, basically, and how people see themselves, how people subjectively see the world around them and perceive as well as feel the world around them. And within that, then, there are talents, resources, and abilities and things that come naturally to you that maybe don't come as naturally to other Enneagram styles. And then the Enneagram also describes typical illusions that you're prone to, and pitfalls and things that motivate you, and ways in which you are kind of blind to other potentials and other dimensions and other ideas. Okay.
And when we had dinner together last night, you were telling me that actually you first heard of the Enneagram over 30 years ago. And at that point, there wasn't actually any written books on the Enneagram.
No.
And you were educating yourself about it from notes from seminars people had written. So it must have been quite exciting to get involved in this, what's proved to be a very helpful tool at quite an early stage.
I got involved with NLP about 1977 and liked aspects of it very much, and still do. NLP is sort of a mixed bag because it has a sort of shallow, opportunistic, sort of sociopathic dimension to it. But actually, the original formulation of it was based on the study of effective psychotherapists and people who helped people change. And what the guys who created it came up with were a number of sort of techniques that were common to a lot of therapies, and then also a way of understanding the inner subjective experience in terms of the senses. How, if somebody has a problem, how do things look, how do the things sound, how do things feel when you're having the problem? And then also then applying techniques towards creating solutions. And NLP had a lot of good stuff in it, but it was also inherently kind of shallow. And it lacked it was not a good system for working with the whole person or comprehending the emotional ground and the subtext and the inner dynamics that generated a problem behavior. And about the time I was realizing this about NLP, I came across the Enneagram. And the Enneagram at that time was taught, I lived in Berkeley, California. It was taught by Helen Palmer and Claudio Naranjo and a few other people. And most of the people that I knew were therapists, and they were all kind of involved in the Enneagram. They'd all heard about it. There were no books. There was nothing in literature. It was all just kind of, Helen would do 10-week courses, which I went to one of them, where she would interview people who all had the same Enneagram style and do panels. And it was, you know, it was very illuminating. It was very obvious that they all shared the same strategy.
So how did you find your own style?
Through notes, mostly, and through the notes. What happened was most of the therapists who went to these courses that I was describing, they would keep the handouts. And then also people would go to the courses and they would make notes and have their own reactions. Yeah. And then they would mimeograph those. They had mimeographs in those days. And then, so this stack of notes kind of grew. It got to be about 4 or 5 inches thick before any of the books ever came out. And I would read within that about the various styles, and it was instantly obvious to me what my style was, which was counterphobic 6. There was already, at that young age, a mountain of evidence to indicate I was a 6.
Were you okay to find out that you were a 6?
Say again?
Were you okay to find out you were a 6?
Well,
what was your reaction, response?
When you find out your Enneagram style, truly find it out, because people will vacillate, and sometimes it's a process. And I always tell students, you know, a good indicator is the one that makes you kind of sick to your stomach a little bit. You
feel it here, but it's not necessarily a good feeling here.
Or you have some sort of physiological...
You feel, oh dear.
Yes, oh my God experiences, rather than an aha experience. And yet, when I came across mine, it was uncomfortable, because I was, especially relating to the downside of it, but it was so obvious and right away really helpful. Because you know, you started to realize, okay, this is a pattern. There's a name for this. There's a name for the type of suffering I've inflicted on myself. And there is a rationale and a schema and a kind of unconscious drive to do it and to reproduce it. And, you know, there's that Chinese saying, the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their right names. And so that was a good first step.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in those days, all of the material, since it was generated by therapists, and also since it was generated by people who had spiritual practices that emphasized the via negativa, which is to say you kind of blast the student with insight and shock them down to their toes. Most of the descriptions were negative in those days. So the name for 6s was kind of simple. It was coward.
Yes.
So that was a little hard to wrap your arms around and, you know, kind of enthusiastically affirm. But nevertheless, it was pretty plain.
Interesting, because when I first found out my type, which is also type 6, was I think about 20 years ago, and I found incredible relief, not only because, well, the basic reasons for the relief were that, first of all, I thought there's other people like me. That means one person in every 9, as there's 9 types, is functioning the same way as me.
1/9 of the truth.
Yeah. Because often I couldn't find out, well, why do I respond? I couldn't understand, why do I respond so differently from other people to situations? So that was kind of a very affirming and very positive. And of course, at that time, there was more books out. There was books out about it. And it was all the information about how to be with that, and as your book is talking about, how to grow with that and use that in a positive way to your advantage to find out more about yourself.
Right.
And that, as I said earlier, is the key for me, is finding out more about myself and about the other. Now, one of the things you say in your book, and you mentioned this also in your introduction, is the Enneagram is an inner map, but of course, for everybody, it's an incomplete map, isn't it?
Well, and also, to the degree that you're caught in the pattern of your Enneagram style, it's an old map. It's, you know, it's one of those maps of the New World that they had in Europe before they had fully explored the New World. Or a better example is there was a map of California that was that represented it as an island, an early map, based on the perceptions of early explorers. And they soon realized it wasn't an island, but it took 150 years for them to actually change the maps. And so it is sort of like you have an inner map, an inner, I think of it almost as an inner flat Earth, you know, and you're sort of sailing on the ocean and trying to avoid, you know, sailing off the edge of your flat Earth, because that is also the edge of your self-definition and your capabilities and your inner subjective universe.
So it's in effect, it's a map of how we see life based on how we were brought up and our experiences.
And what we adapted to,
And how we
adaptations
handle those experiences.
how we handle those experiences. When you're caught in the, I mean, it's more than that. I mean, you're born probably with a temperament and a predisposition towards certain Enneagram styles. Some people insist it's genetic and that you're born with your Enneagram style. I would question that just simply because I have identical twins in my family and they don't have the same Enneagram styles. And we won't know until there's a blood test in any case.
Yeah, so you're raising an interesting point here, which is a little bit controversial in the Enneagram world. Some people say it's generic, as you say, and you're born with it. Other people say it's to do with the conditioning right from your very early childhood.
My wife had the best comment on this at one point. She's a 9. She said, well, you know, I may have been born a 9, but I definitely learned to be unhealthy. And I thought, yeah, that kind of captures it, because what you're, at least in my work and the work of a lot of people, the emphasis is on how to grow and change and evolve out of stuck points and rigid patterns or ways in which you sort of over-identify with one aspect of your personality and under-identify with another, where you kind of have an ideal, but it's defensive. A 1 will identify with being good and right and virtuous, and then the capacity to sin and make chaos and break the rules, that's sort of pushed away, becomes a shadow. And in doing that, then you're making a kind of inner defensive arrangement that protects you in certain ways when you're growing up. Maybe the 1 grew up in an environment where there are high standards in the air, or there was a lot of criticism in the air, or it was just implied that you had to really do your best. And so the person internalized those high standards and tried to push away other aspects of their personality, make them into a shadow, basically.
So it's if we construct in our mind these boundaries, don't we? We construct an understanding of how we see life to be, and it's that what's kind of inhibits us in later life, because it's useful. Those boundaries may be useful when we're very young,
right,
because it protects us, but when we get older they become redundant, but we don't realize they're redundant.
Well, and it's like getting addicted to pain pills or something. You know, the thing that saved you in the first place, or relieved your pain, or allowed you to adapt to whatever your family circumstance was, whatever your early experience of life was, what the role in your family you were expected to play. All those things can have a defensive cast, where the self gets kind of warped or misshapen, and then there's a shadow that goes with it. And then the thing that saved you turns out to be the thing that gets in your way some decades later.
Yeah, so it worked once and then it stops
Yeah.
being effective anymore.
Right, but we get
Yeah.
attached to how it worked.
Yes.
And parts of ourselves get kind of time locked as well. Where you reach some barrier when you're a kid and you're in some circumstance that's overwhelming or extremely painful or just confounding. And you start to do things to yourself that happen to you the most. And in doing that, there's an element of control that comes into it.
Yeah.
And then you find out later you're still sort of generating something that corresponds with the low side of your Enneagram style, and you're baffled by it. And various schools of the Enneagram have names for that. They'll call it a compulsion or a fixation or a habit, an emotional habit. But there's some logic to it as well. There's an underlying drive, there's an underlying will within it to reproduce it, because on some level you sort of believe in it as a method.
Is an example you can give from your own life of something that served you when you were younger, and then you had to really be aware that as you got older, that didn't work the best for you anymore?
Sixes scare themselves. And I grew up around Irish alcoholics who used to drink and fight. And I remember developing a sort of strategy where I would sit at the dinner table, and if I saw people starting to drink, I started to, in my own mind, predict the weather. What was going to happen in 20 minutes. Because things could go crazy. Somebody could, when they were drunk, they could have an argument about the peas at dinner. A lot of it was sort of nonsensical, but it was also kind of unpleasant. So, as a six, one of the things you do is you start to imagine negative scenarios and kind of anticipate and fantasize. And the logic behind it, the defensive logic, is that you're trying to prepare for what might go wrong or what might happen that would be unpredictable in order to be prepared for it, so you'll handle it in a strong way. But the paradox of it is that actually when you scare yourself, the more you scare yourself, the more you feel kind of helpless.
Yes.
And kind of young and resourceless.
Yeah.
So it's got this back to front quality.
So it takes your power away, your own power away, which, and when you're young, you're powerless.
Well,
but when you're older, you actually have some power.
Well, you have, when you're young, you actually, maybe it makes sense to give away your power in a circumstance where your power is going to be taken from you anyway.
Yes.
But when you're older, it's like you're giving away your power to imaginary authorities or other people or conspiracy theories or something like that. And when you're doing that, you're missing a piece of yourself. You sort of react to your own power out there in other people and have a self-image of being maybe young and helpless, lurking within it somewhere.
Yeah.
So sixes are unusually contradictory among Enneagram styles this way, but all of the styles have a sort of ruling paradox built into them, where they're, style number 3, they're quite performance-oriented and image-oriented, and when you scratch down to it and kind of summarize it, it's like the person believes, in order to be loved for who I am, I have to pretend to be who I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk in the book, and it's an interesting word you use for me, you talk about that we're in a trance a lot of the time.
I use that that term in a specific way because I have a background in hypnosis. And it sounds like a loose metaphor, but actually when you look closely at the inner subjective experience of different Enneagram styles, especially when people are caught in their patterns, they actually have trance-like characteristics that correspond with studies of official hypnosis. Things like certain Enneagram styles are prone to amnesia, and hypnotic subjects sometimes will be prone to amnesia. Other Enneagram styles are prone to the opposite of amnesia, which is hypermnesia, which is where you have, instead of forgetting things, you remember things in very unusually sensory-rich, vivid detail. Style number 4 will do that. 6s will do it too, where you remember some awful thing that happened in the past, or a 4 will be nostalgic for a time when they were 20 years old and in love for the first time, and life had a certain kind of beauty, and they remember the smells and the song that united them with their beloved, and there's a lot of sensory-rich detail in it that they get preoccupied with as they sort of take themselves out of the present. And so when I say a trance, it really is like an open-eyed hypnotic trance, and there's a lot of correspondence with it.
Yeah, but it makes sense that we're going through life in a way, and we are partly hypnotized by our early beliefs, and it stops us seeing reality, doesn't it?
It does, and then what I do like about disciplines like NLP and working with hypnosis is that they pretty much approach working with the inner life and approaching working with problems as things that we create ourselves, that we make this stuff up, that we are self-generating, even if we're generating from an unconscious level. You can read in Enneagram books. Sometimes the wording in Enneagram books is kind of fatalistic and passive. It sounds like something that's just descended upon you that you're stuck with, kind of like a scarlet number on your forehead or something. And I find it a lot more useful to approach it from the standpoint of how much of this is learned behavior, and how much of it, if it's learned, you can overwrite it, you can unlearn it, you can delve into the depths of it and find emotional stuck points and maybe feelings you couldn't handle earlier in life that you can now manage because there's so much more of you. Or free yourself in a variety of ways. And I don't know that there's a limit to that, and that then tracks over into how people experience the Enneagram spiritually too, or their, what they open up to as they grow and change. Old kind of themes fall away, and old conflicts, get resolved, and then there's you have the sense of living less of a story, less of a script, and have more of a sense of being in the present and responding to life and aware of the vastness of life around you.
And the richness that comes with that.
Yeah, living a more complete life.
Yeah. So tell me more about yourself insofar as how that's affected you as a human being, because you've been on this long journey with the Enneagram. You gave an example earlier of something that was helpful when you realised it. But how do you generally feel? Okay, you talk about being a counterphobic 6. How do you generally feel about life now? Has your view fundamentally changed?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, it's fundamentally softened and lessened compared to where I came from. When I first came across the Enneagram, I was pretty much in a mode of perceiving danger wherever I looked. And the counterphobic style within 6 is to sort of go against the danger.
To jump over it, yes.
Jump over it.
Yeah.
And I used to literally do things like jump off of bridges onto moving trains.
Really?
Yeah. And climb hotels.
Well, you climbed hotels on the outside?
Yeah, they have these ladders that go up the side.
Wow.
I'd do things like that. And part of the reason for doing it, apart from being young, impulsive, and reckless, was that if you did, I always had the sense I could do it. Do you understand? It wasn't a complete, it was a calculated risk. But when I would do things like that, then I would be free from fear for a few days.
And is that what happened in effect?
Yes, it was. It was like expunging the fear. And
Yeah.
then the habit, the undealt with habit of scaring myself, would creep back in by, I'd do something daring on Saturday, and then by Tuesday I was, starting to get a bad case of nerves again.
This is a very interesting point. So, and I guess this applies in its own way to the other types as well, that you can do something that in a way takes you out of the habit of that type. But on the other hand, you've almost got to do your homework as such in understanding and working in a less dramatic way, just to loosen up and lessen the effect of that, the history of the type.
I would kind of classify different approaches to working with something like an Enneagram style, and maybe in a broader way if you think about it in terms of therapy or change or trying to evolve in whatever way appeals to you the most or is necessary the most. There are approaches that involve going against the problem, and this was what I'm describing is certainly that. I was going against my own fear, and I was trying to, the advantage of it sometimes, and they recommend this sometimes in Enneagram books, is that you create counterexamples to your normal experience, quote unquote normal experience, and you maybe make more space and more gather more life experience that contradicts the tendency that you have when you're maintaining your pattern. So it's good for that. It's not so good for really getting over it, if that's all you do. Because if you just go against the premises of your style or the tendencies or the compulsions or what have you, then a lot of times you just strengthen the conflict within you, sort of like isometrics. And then there are other approaches that involve standing back from your style. Certainly a lot of dissociative meditation techniques are like this, where you are trying to witness the pattern and see it rather than, say, feel it, for example. And where you are trying to, again, expand your awareness so that you are not taking your own behavior personally, not taking your own pattern personally, and maybe seeing the workings of it and the kind of the intricacies of it without reacting quite so strongly in your body, say, for instance, and in your feelings. And then there are other approaches.
Let's just take that, because that's an interesting thing I'd like to follow through with you. So, yes, there's a lot. We've had a lot of people on this on Conscious TV itself too, who talk about that they sit and they see. They're not the body. They're not the thoughts. They're not the emotions. And there's a certain freedom in that, and there's a huge realization, because you realize at that level you are not the body, or not just the body, the thoughts and the emotions.
Not just the body.
That's right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we've got the reality, day-to-day reality, or moment-to-moment reality, that we have the vehicle of the body in which to live our life. And it's something that I didn't get for a time, but I now see more and more the importance of, yes, you want that realization, because that realization is it's showing you the bigger picture. It's showing you who you really are.
Right.
But integrating that realization in day-to-day life, that becomes really the key. And that's certainly from reading through your book. There's a lot of advice, a lot of ideas there, how you can do this process of integration, but understanding the humanness more. It just doesn't go away, does it?
No, it doesn't. And, we are incarnated and we're living in the world, and, our bodies have a lifespan, and certain things bring health and certain things don't. And it's sort of a little like a self-image, To me, a lot of this work involves realizing that you are more than your self-image, realizing that you are more than your body, but you are also your body. I mean, it's sort of like, if you can handle it, it's like having two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. And, both are true at different times. There was a rabbi one time who said, you should go through life with things in two pockets. And when you come into a new situation, you can reach into one pocket and pull out a little note to yourself that says, the world is made for me. And then the note in the other pocket says, I am but ashes and dust. And he said, the trick to life is knowing which pocket to reach into at which time.
And knowing that either is not the total truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You also talk about the void in the book, which is something that I've certainly experienced from time to time in my life. And just talk us through how you see the void.
Well, as you grow and change, you lessen your people don't really evolve out of their Enneagram styles and turn into another style or have no style, I would say, any more than they evolve out of their nationalities. But as you grow and change, you wear it more and more lightly. And in doing so, you're more and more open. There's less and less in the way of you and the world around you, both externally, and then when you look inside, internally, there's far more space. People start to have spontaneous experiences of the void, of the mysterium tremendum. And we were talking a little bit about the difference between maybe looking at the night sky and seeing it as almost a ceiling or a kind of an umbrella that has little pinprick lights in it, versus occasionally when the stars are out in a remote place, for example, you look into the night sky and you sort of feel the distances in your body. It's sort of like you feel yourself kind of sucked up into space in a way. And that's quite a different sort of apperception of what's around us. But we're on this tiny planet. We're all very involved in our lives, and rightly so. And there's a vast number of cultures, and the cultures all have histories. And yet we're in a suburb of the Milky Way galaxy, and there's 100 billion other galaxies. And the new telescopes are showing us just more and more distance, strangeness, and something in us defends against that. And yet at the same time, as you grow and change, you start to open up to wider and broader and deeper and farther realities, I'd say.
Because you talk about that the void can be intense, formless, beautiful, but it can also be frightening and unnerving.
Well, most people have a kind of dual reaction to it, and I would say unconscious minds kind of protect us from the perception that, we're surrounded by infinity. I mean, it's something that people seek, because it's sort of like extinguishing the self means extinguishing its suffering. And so we go towards experiences where we get in the flow, where we lose ourselves, experiences that are immersive, that take us out of our normal frame of mind. And then at the same time, if we go too far, then we're sort of sailing on the edge of the flat earth. And then there's those waterfalls they talked about in medieval times. And down below there's dragons and rocks. And, the ships break up on the rocks, and then the dragons eat the sailors. And there's something in the unconscious that then guards that boundary. And we sort of contract, we sort of maintain our worldview.
Yeah, because we believe somehow we go past the boundary, which is we've constructed
that
we're going to perish, yeah.
Yeah, and in a way that's true. It's sort of like ego death, which is different from physical death, but on some unconscious level that we're not making that distinction a lot of the time.
Mm. You also talk in the book about families and how you say we carry our family around with us. Just explain that a little bit more.
Well, I think it's the family therapist Salvador Minuchin said families create specialists. And what he meant was that families are systems, and there are roles to play within families and functions to serve within families that are based on whatever is needed within the family and for it to function well. And so someone comes into a family and they are to a certain extent typecast. It depends on what the family needs. Does it need a hero? Does it need a screw up? Does it need someone who makes conflict, someone who avoids conflict? Families create specialists in this sense, and so you can sometimes see pretty clearly a family doesn't cause someone to have a certain Enneagram style, but you can see how the role that they played in their family of origin it comes out through the expression, especially of the problematic or the low side of their Enneagram style. And then the tendency is to recreate that sort of invisibly and unconsciously and without realizing it in your own family as you grow up and create one, but also, you know, maybe in your workplace, for example, you know, seeing the boss as a kind of parent, relating to coworkers as you might relate to a sibling, that kind of thing. And it's all very subtle, and some of it doesn't matter because it works very well, but sometimes what you start to realize is that you're carrying with you a sort of field of experience, and you're filtering the world that as you find it through that field, and kind of relating to people in ways that are familiar, and also kind of setting up new situations that are, you know, presumably untarnished. You kind of come in and you sully them up with unconscious assumptions and expectations and requirements, and, you know, things have to go this way. If they don't, it means that. And there's a way in which all of that stuff is kind of grist for the mill, for stuff to work on and kind of catch yourself in the act, and then maybe to unhitch from.
It really is work.
It is work.
To get to the bottom of this, isn't it? And it's, I know one of the things for myself was that a lot of the time I found the work truly fascinating, because I found more and more, when I looked at myself, I was interested to find out why I was the way I was. Mm-hmm. And it kind of, not only was it practically helpful, but it's an intriguing, the inner journey is an intriguing journey, just as going on an adventure and walking across mountains or driving, wherever people drive. Right. That inner journey is also, it's interesting because certain people take to it naturally, other people just resist it. And I don't know whether you have a feel for this, all your years of experience, about what are the factors that really encourage someone to follow the inner journey as opposed to the ones that are really just trying to ignore the whole thing and get by.
Well, motivation to change is really an important thing. And there are no rules about it. You know, there's no book anywhere that describes who should change and how much, or whether they should change. You know, it's got to do with, for most people, it's got to do with how much they're suffering, and maybe the inkling that they have somewhere that they may have a hand in their own suffering. And then that leads them in certain directions to seek out methods and to seek out context where it would be safe and it's encouraged to grow and change. Some people grow and change, in my experience, a smaller percentage based on a kind of aspiration and curiosity, and, you know, I wonder what it would be like if I went beyond this, you know, this sort of thing, where there's more of a positive motivation, you might say, to change. And then within Enneagram styles, there are different considerations as well. There are certain Enneagram styles when people are caught in their pattern, they suffer a lot more. Sixes, for example, ones, for example, fours, for example. And then there are other Enneagram styles who have defenses that make them feel better. Sevens will reframe things and find the positive in difficult and painful experiences, and kind of jump to the positive benefit a little too fast when they're caught in their pattern. And what does that do for motivation? You know, if your way of coping is to just generally make yourself feel better, you might not get as distressed as you really ought to about something that you have a tendency to do or recreate or hang on to. There's another, with style number 9, for example, one of the things I will ask in workshops sometimes is I'll ask the 9s to tell me the first number that comes into their mind when I ask the question. And the question is, how long do you expect to live? And the number is almost always between 85 and 110. What does that do for motivation?
It's quite optimistic, isn't it?
Well, they may be right. Someday there'll be a medical, if there's ever a blood test or something like that, there might be a medical workup of the different styles, and I wouldn't be surprised if 9s on average lived longer. It's a type B personality, you know, you don't get too up, you handle stress pretty well. There's a lot of things to suggest that might be true anecdotally. But if I'm in my middle 60s, but I'm going to live to be 85, I'm going to live to be 110, and there's something that I'm doing that is affecting my life or affecting my relationships, or I'm in a conflict with somebody in some way, or there's something that I have a bad habit, or there's something I have to change, but I'm going to live to be 110.
You got the time to do it.
You know, what's that, 45 years? Why rush into this thing?
So which of the types, when you ask that question, gives the answer with the least number of years they have to live?
I haven't asked the other styles that question so much. What they tend to do, there are styles where the future seems shorter, usually.
Yeah.
Like style number 4. But a lot of times they'll say, well, I don't know, you know, I don't know how long I'll live, but the past is what's in front of me, not the future. When 4s are in their trance, 6s too, when they're in their trance, they'll kind of be focused on the past rather than the future, and they'll have trouble kind of thinking about the future.
You also talk in the book about there's 2 versions of the Enneagram in a way. There's the Enneagram of personality and the Enneagram of everything. Can you explain how you see the distinction there between the 2? Well,
I'm speaking out of and operating with and working with the Enneagram of personality. And then there is another sort of version of it that's kind of inherited from Gurdjieffian sources, fourth way sources, and other people have had a fair amount of input into this that sort of looks at contexts and various aspects of life in terms of the Enneagram. And also has a lot of symbolism attached to it that I don't personally find very useful. I don't really even know how to describe it well, except that it's quite rarefied. There are people who use it who get a lot out of it, so I don't have any problem with that part. But it's more to do with a sort of spiritualized approach that is basically framed as here's how to reach your highest potential, and here's what your highest potential is.
But that's also what you're working with the Enneagram of personality, isn't it?
I would say so.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
But I don't really try to formulate what those things are too closely. I'm not very theoretical, basically.
Yeah, you're going stage by stage practically and seeing where the adventure leads for people.
Also kind of allowing for, you know, approaching change at various levels, from neurotic stuck points to kind of evolving beyond, you know, your worldview in a broader way. So I always think that working with biography is a complement to working with a spiritual practice, and vice versa.
Yeah.
That they're not contradictory, even though some people will kind of polarize that way. It's one or the other. But they both have their advantages, and then if you only do one or the other, then they both have their limitations. You know, if you only work in a psychiatric way, a psychological way on your biography, then you can be like Woody Allen, who's been in therapy for 40 years. Something like that.
Nothing's changed, is it?
Well, I don't know, but
it doesn't seem from his films that anything's changed.
Yeah, it doesn't seem so. Yeah, it doesn't seem so different. And then if you only work in a spiritual way and ignore biography, biography comes up and bites you in the ass sometimes.
Yeah.
Basically, it's, you know, and you can, people will sometimes get into spiritualizing their egos in a way. So it's sort of like I'm trying to be spiritual and I have these high level aspirations, and, you know, these other little kind of dark details in life are not me.
Yeah.
But other people in your life have to deal with them if that becomes a shadow.
So we have just over 5 minutes left. Let's use that in a kind of practical way, insofar as somebody who's watching this and doesn't, say, never heard of the Enneagram, but is a little intrigued about what you're talking about and would like to find out more about it and maybe their type. What would be the starting point for them?
There are tests, and there are some relatively good ones. They only measure, they're only about 70% accurate, any of them, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And partially that's because you have things in you, you not only have a central Enneagram style, but you have secondary Enneagram styles, secondary connections that show up that start to make sense once you learn the system. But you also have like the Enneagram styles of your parents within you. You know, everybody knows they kind of introject their parents. Well, that also includes the parents' Enneagram style. And tests can't really measure that because it's not consistent, you know. A 6 doesn't always have an 8 father and a 2 mother or something like that. And so it can be a little confusing, but what's a good starting point is to begin to expose yourself to the material, maybe take a test, and take it with a grain of salt, and try to begin to think about and to observe in daily life, well, what are my reactions? What are my motivations? How am I seeing the world? How am I sort of perceiving things when I have this particular reaction that seems like it relates to being a 9, or seems like it relates to being a 2, or something like that. And beginning to kind of fish for what your own motivations are, it's almost like a thought you think all day long. You know, it's something that you keep returning to. So a kind of meta pattern that your unconscious is generating, but also attached to. And in trying to do that, then the difficulty can be that not everybody is a psychologist, number one. Number two, it's almost like a fish trying to see water, or a human trying to see the air. Because basically what you're trying to do is ask yourself, well, what are my basic unconscious assumptions about reality? You know? And they're unconscious for some people.
Yeah.
And yet sometimes you might begin to think about, they'll say sometimes, some Enneagram teachers will say, well, think about what you were like when you were 20 years old and what you were going through. And you know, sometimes there are periods in life where something like an Enneagram style is more apparent and more vividly expressed. And that can sometimes be helpful too. Also, this system won't make you honest. You know, that's something you have to bring to the party. And so if you can be as honest with yourself as you can, that really helps quite a bit. And then, like we were saying, motivation. You know, sometimes people will come into contact with the Enneagram, and it's like, oh, that's interesting, you know, and it sounds like a bunch of stereotypes to them. And maybe that's a consequence of who's teaching it, or who's maybe they met somebody at a party, and somebody at a party had just gone to an Enneagram workshop, and now they're type happy and they're running around typing everyone in sight, you know. But occasionally someone will come in contact with the Enneagram that way, think nothing of it, and then come in contact with it a couple of years later, and it blows their mind.
Yeah.
It just shakes them shakes their tree.
Yeah. Certainly, as I was saying at the beginning, one of the things for me is understanding other people better, especially people I don't get on with, or I don't seem to get on with. And it's that thing of kind of, well, I'll either go at working their type out, their style, as you call it, out, and then I may not get it completely right, but in a way it doesn't matter, because I feel just by the act of trying to understand them more opens something in the relationship. And then if I have got the style right and I read up about it, then I'm more understanding of how their mind's working and why they are the way they are. And that isn't that the basis of nearly every conflict and every war. It's a lack of understanding of the other and having a different viewpoint, and also not being willing to listen to somebody else's viewpoint.
Well, and also, you know, wars are situations where two groups of people are sort of identical, and then they accuse each other of being what they believe they are not. You know, there's this kind of shadow play that's going on, and you know, people on both sides of a war behave abominably, and so there's sort of the recognition of your own shadow within it sometimes, but also the ability to step into other people's shoes and to understand the world from their point of view is a great thing, because you sort of de-vilify them, for one thing. Also, it's a lot like, you know, as an American, I come to Europe and operate in a bunch of different cultures in Europe, and there are guidebooks for, you know, what to do and what not to do in different cultures, you know. Always be on time in Switzerland, you know. Never do this in France. And it is kind of like appreciating differences in nationalities.
Yes.
And you can decide you don't like certain Enneagram styles, I suppose, but that's not really the point.
Yeah.
The point is that this goes on whether you like it or not. And if you decide there are certain Enneagram styles that you don't like, that can also be an indicator of something that's unintegrated within you. You know?
Yes. And I think, for myself, that if I understand the other better, I actually end up understanding myself better.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's that point where the understanding starts to drift away, and you actually feel you go beyond the understanding, that there's a connection there. And
you have compassion for yourself just as you develop compassion for others.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, the clock's ticking away, and we have the reality of time. We have about 2 minutes left. I don't know whether you want to squeeze anything else that's important to you that we haven't covered in the last 2 minutes.
Well, one thing I'd like to underline is that when people are doing their Enneagram style, quote unquote, when they are especially caught in the pattern, that there are typical sensory qualities that go with the different styles, and that make up the kind of illusion of being within a subjective universe that's quite compelling, that goes with the low side of your style. And that sometimes beginning to identify those can be really helpful, because you start to realize, oh my gosh, I'm doing this to myself somehow. But also, it's sort of like we talked earlier about living a story. It's not just a verbal story. It's a story that has kind of visual components, and it's a story that has kinesthetic components as well, both in the emotions and in body kinesthetics, which are, you know, a little different from each other. So when a person is in their Enneagram trance, they're seeing the world a certain way, they're talking to themselves a certain way, they're feeling a certain way, and all of those sensory qualities are recurrent. There are things that the person is unconsciously inducing and re-inducing in themselves. And as they start to sort of realize that and start to sort of work with it, it can really be very helpful to opening up and to dropping old defenses and kind of letting, resolving past conflicts and battles and so on. But also you alter your inner experience of yourself. Another way to put this is, I'll sometimes ask people to in a detailed way in workshops, in a detailed way to identify what are the sensory components of the low side of their Enneagram style, and then for contrast's sake, what are the sensory components of the high side of your Enneagram style? What's it like when you're at your best? What's it like when you are functioning within your style and what you identify as the high side of your style, even based on descriptions you've read? What's it like when you're not an Enneagram style? You know, what's it like when you've pretty much escaped the mortal coil of it, you know? And
So in simple terms, it's like going into the feeling of the style.
But not just the feeling, and kind of subtleties in the feelings, like when fives scare themselves, for instance, the fear is in the middle of their chest, it's not in their kneecaps.
Yes.
Something like that. And beginning to really identify and specify. It's also sort of like when people say they have a fear of flying. A lot of times that's an umbrella term, and then when you kind of go into it more deeply with them, some people will say, well, I have a fear of turbulence. Another person will say, I have a fear of takeoff and landing. Another person will say, I have a kind of claustrophobic reaction to being locked in a metal tube with a bunch of strangers. And so those are really different problems, although they all kind of come under the umbrella of fear of flying. And this is sort of like, what I'm talking about is sort of like specifying and beginning to discern and discriminate between what's it like when you're at your worst, what's it like when you're at your best, and what are the sensory components of that.
Okay.
It helps a lot.
Okay, good. Tom, thank you very much. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you everyone again for watching Conscious TV. Here's the cover of Tom's book, which the Dynamic Enneagram, which is available as an e-book and will shortly be available as a physical book as well. So thanks again, and hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.